I'm here now with the three winners of the U of L Grawemeyer Award, 2019 U of L Grawemeyer Award for Ideas for Improving World Order. So congratulations, ladies, first off, and I'll introduce you going from my left to right because it's easiest for me to do that. Sakiko Fukudapar, Tara Lawson-Remer, and Susan Randolph. Did I get them all right?
You did.
Yes.
I got all those names right? Well, congratulations again on winning the Grawemeyer Award.
Thank you so much.
So what happened when you first got the call, or who got the first call or whatever saying, hey, you guys have won the Grawemeyer Award?
I don't know who got the first call. I think we each got it individually. We don't live anywhere near each other, so we didn't really find out until.
All right. Well, what was your reaction?
Wow.
Really? I'm so honored. I mean, to be honest, I think we spent about 9 years on this project for it to come to fruition, and it's just an honor to be able to share it with the community here in Louisville, but sort of the larger community that the award represents.
Mm-hmm. So Kiko, what was your reaction?
Well, you know, after a sort of a bit of a gulp, I think I felt it was really quite wonderful that something like economic and social rights should be selected, because I thought it was sort of not a particularly popular concept, and many people would not really think that was so important. But because socioeconomic rights had been neglected for so long, and so that was a particular joy, actually, to see that the whole concept of economic and social rights would be recognized.
And somebody was paying attention to it. Yeah.
Yep.
How did the three of you get together? How do you know each other? You said, what, 9 years?
I'll go ahead.
Sure. I mean, we were working, I think I was working on a project where this was questions of measurement of economic and social rights was really central. And so was Susan, and we didn't know each other, but we both knew Sakiko. So I had come to Sakiko and said, I'm working on this project. Do you have any ideas? Do I even need to do this? Has someone else done this already? And she said, no, we should probably do this. And she had known Susan, and they were collaborating, and we had a conference where we shared ideas, and it was really, really early in the work, which was fantastic because we were all so excited to meet each other and to find out that we had sort of separately happened upon this as such a core, important area of inquiry. And we brought really different skills to the work and could see that all of our work would be stronger together. And so we decided to collaborate.
And we were able to brainstorm and shoot ideas off of each other, and that was really important in sort of coming up with an idea that we thought was good.
Okay. Again, we're talking with Sakiko Fukudapar, Tara Lawson-Remer, and Susan Randolph, who are the winners of the 2019 U of L Grawemeyer Award for Ideas for Improving World Order. And I guess we ought to get to what you won for. Y'all wrote a book, right? Tell me what the book was and what the premise of the book was.
Who wants to take this one?
Oh, why don't you take it?
Okay.
All right, that's Tara's taking it.
Sure, happy to do it. Happy to do it. I mean, so I think there's you can think about the work in sort of two parts. One is, how do we operationalize a normative framework that's social and economic rights, this core principle that's embedded in international human rights law, that countries should be obligated to fulfill the social and economic rights of their citizens to the maximum of available resources. That is a normative commitment that countries around the world have made since 1948, and it's binding on country signatories. But there had been no metric and no measure and no mechanism to hold countries accountable for their social and economic rights obligations. In addition to there being no metric of accountability, there was really no analytical tool to allow us to understand what kind of policies best drive fulfillment of social and economic rights obligations. And so there was an enormous gap. Despite these global commitments, there was no mechanisms for accountability and no mechanism for research to figure out how to best further and advance those normative commitments that all countries have made. So there was a big knowledge gap and a big accountability gap, and we set out to fill that. And so that's really the core of what we did, was translate these abstract normative commitments into concrete, objective, quantitative metrics that translate legal obligations into quantitative measures for which countries can be measured across time, comparatively across space, held accountable, and also, frankly, assisted to improve their delivery of economic and social rights, because now we can research and better understand what works and what doesn't work in fulfilling these basic commitments.
So that's
Go ahead,
part
Susan.
of the book.
Okay.
The other
Thank you.
part really is a summary of a research agenda that
Yeah.
emanated from that development of an index. We had questions as to what kinds of policies would work, under what kinds of contexts, which countries were doing well, which countries were doing poorly, had there been progress over time, what was the nature of that progress, was it uniform across economic and social rights. And so once we had the index, we began a fairly serious research project trying to address many of these questions. And what the book does is it summarizes much of that research.
Right, and you came up with an index, right?
Yes.
For judging how well countries, whether they are rich or poor, are working towards meeting those goals of, well, I'm calling them goals, I think you call them requirements, right,
Obligations, yeah.
of economic and social rights, correct?
Yep.
Yes.
So what is this index, and how do you measure whether the United States is doing a great job versus North Korea on these social rights issues?
Well, one of the first, let me start answering that question by telling you that there are many, many ways that you can try to solve that, approach that problem of how do you measure this. And most of the debate and discussion and efforts to measure economic and social rights, well, human rights generally, have raised many problems, at least for the three of us. And I think this is the reason why we came together to work together, because we found problematic a number of ways that had been attempted. First of all, is to use qualitative judgments to assess whether a country was doing well in human rights.
Like what? When you're talking about qualitative judgments, like what?
Well,
Food,
whether people are hungry or not.
housing, that kind of thing?
Yes, but with other kinds of human rights, for example, there are political freedom index, media freedom index, corruption index. All of these things depend on whether you think that this country is corrupt or not. And they turn that into a number. That, to us, is not objective, it's not empirical, it's not evidence-based.
Okay.
It's also not really comparable across countries. So objectivity was one of them. The second thing is that most of the efforts had focused on, with economic and social rights, using socioeconomic data such as schooling rates, malnutrition rates, things like that. But that's just whether a person is well-being is adequate to say that this person is free from want. The concept of human rights, however, as Tara mentioned, explained, is that governments have committed to doing something about it.
Right.
To making sure
They're
that
working towards something.
nobody, yes, and that nobody is left out and denied these rights. And so there is the government obligation side of it, the government accountability side of it. And that government accountability side of it has essentially to do with whether they're doing enough in all that they can do. It's a commitment to do all that they can possibly do. And that depends on resources. And this is the essential problem, the challenge.
Right.
Right?
Right, because the United States is a rich country doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing a better job of moving towards that than a country that's poor but is allocating a lot of its resources towards more social justice issues. Am I on the right path?
You hit the
Okay, we're done with this interview, right?
You
I'm
got
done.
it.
Sarah should have wrote the book with you.
That's right.
We have found a fourth collaborator in the book project.
And to sort of say that, more than 100 children die before the age of 5 in Sierra Leone and this is a denial of human rights. So, well, you can't compare Sierra Leone with the United States, right? So
they don't have the resources.
they don't have the resources. But, is poverty really an excuse for children dying before the age of 5? Somehow you have to empirically analyze how much resources you need to achieve a better result. And that's essentially what this is all about. And I think the core idea behind the measurement is to say, okay, empirically, what was the best performance that was achieved by countries at a given level of income?
All right. Well, Tara Lawson-Remer or Susan Randolph, why don't you tell me the obvious question? You got this index. you put it all together, who are the countries that are doing a good job of working towards social equity and those kinds of issues?
Well, I think there's a whole range of countries. For example, Uruguay is, I think, one that many don't think of.
I wouldn't have thought of it.
Among low and middle income countries. Jordan does quite well. Moldova does quite well. In terms of high income countries, it is actually the normal suspect. The Nordic countries tend to do very well.
Sweden, Norway,
Finland, etc. In terms of those countries doing very poorly, a lot of them are countries that have large extractive primary product exports that really don't have much of a developed economy beyond a very small sector. So these would be countries like Gabon, like Equatorial Guinea, where they haven't diversified their economy at all. They just have, it's almost like an artificial engine of growing GDP per capita that doesn't distribute any income to anybody in the country.
That the rich control more of the wealth and don't distribute it to those.
There's no real development going on as a result of those exports. That's not to say primary product exports can't actually lead to good outcomes. It's just we find that many of the bottom, they aren't doing that.
Tara, how's the United States doing?
We're not doing so well, to be honest. I actually, Susan just finished some work looking more robustly at the U.S. I think some of the most interesting insights to me are the disparities in rights enjoyment between different groups within the United States. That in fact, when you disaggregate African American population versus white population in the U.S., for every single state, blacks do worse than the worst performing white. The best performing black subgroup does worse than the worst performing whites. And so there's really like significant disparity in rights enjoyment across different groups in the United States.
Based on race.
Based on race, which violates the fundamental commitments of economic and social rights, that these are rights that belong to all of us, that as by virtue of our humanity. And I think that is one of the principles, this principle of non-discrimination embedded in these human rights instruments that's so profound, that we wanted to foreground, and I think is one of the biggest challenges that the United States faces.
And as we're talking about your book, which is called Fulfilling Social and Economic Rights, and that's why you won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award, but part of that book also talked about, well, when there needs to be change and social justice needs to rise to the top, what happens? Can it come from the ground up, or does it always come from the ground up? Does it always come top down? How do these countries turn it around, in other words? Is it incumbent upon their citizens to make that happen?
Maybe there's sort of three things we're talking about. One is the relationship between growth and economic and social rights fulfillment. I think Susan can speak to that. Which is really interesting, just very quickly, two things to note. One, investing in gender equality is a huge driver towards better economic and social rights outcomes, one of the strongest correlates. And the second is that democracies don't always do very well, and autocracies don't always do very poorly. So you have some very high-performing autocratic countries and some middling performing democratic countries. But really crucially, no democracies do terribly. There's basically a floor on economic and social rights performance. So if you're a democracy, you might do well or you might muddle through, but you're not just failing your citizens. Autocracies, some of them do really well, some of them are muddling through, and some of them are abysmal,
really
abject failure and a human rights catastrophe. And I think that relationship is really significant for us to note. But Susan?
I think with regard to the growth question, I mean, the question arises, if it takes resources in order for countries to fulfill economic and social rights, are you better off devoting all your energies and your investment towards growing the economy, growing your resources? Or should you actually pay attention right from the get-go to improving economic and social rights outcomes for people? And the research we did fairly rigorously addressed that question. And what we found was that a strategy of growth first was very likely to either keep you locked into low social and economic rights fulfillment relative to your resources, or move you to a much worse position of both low social and economic rights and low growth. But if you follow a strategy of improving economic and social rights, you have a very good chance of converting to what I would call the virtuous category, high growth, high economic and social rights, and staying there.
Gotcha.
So that seemed to be a
Maintaining
really
that.
important message.
All right, last question. Charles Grawemeyer, when he founded the Grawemeyer Awards in 1984, said that he had this vision that a single idea, a great idea, could really make a big change in the world. How does your book and your index make a great change in the world, or how could it make a great change in the world? I know it's a hard question, but I'm going to ask it
maybe
anyways.
each can take
Each
it.
of us.
Give me your 2
each of us
cents.
can take some.
Briefly.
Well, actually, I have joined forces with a couple of colleagues, and we have set up a little NGO, and what we are trying to do is take these measures and these ideas to the advocacy community. So it's called the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, or we lovingly call it HRMI,
Okay.
and humanrightsmeasurement.org, a little advertisement there. And we're working with on-the-ground advocates to try to come up with sorts of data visualization that they can effectively take to their governments or share with others in the same struggles that will make them be able to advocate more effectively.
Okay. Tara?
For me, there's, I think, 3 possibilities that I hope that this index can advance. The one is a normative framework, right? When we look at evaluating countries and communities on successes and failures across time, too often we look at GDP per capita and growth and these measures. Money. We look at money. And that is, we do not have a set of global treaties committing everyone to do the best they can on money, right? We have a set of treaties committing everyone to do, all these countries to do the best they can on economic and social rights fulfillment. And we hope that instead of evaluating countries on success based on money, we are able to shift the conversation to evaluate countries and communities and states on how well they're doing on fulfilling economic and social rights as the core normative commitment of the international community. So to me, that's number 1. Number 2, how do you do this sort of practically? I think we provide a tool that can be utilized by the human rights community in terms of improving state accountability for fulfilling their economic and social rights obligations in UN periodic reviews, in the kinds of analysis that the human rights community is already undertaking to audit and ensure that countries are adhering to their human rights obligations, and they didn't previously have that tool. And the third thing is now we have a research tool. So now we can actually look and see what kind of policies are most likely to drive economics and social rights fulfillment and which ones are least likely to do so. And as a researcher, of course, I think that's profound.
You got a measurement. Sakiko, final word, very briefly.
I think that they've said it all, but
All
I
right.
think what I do want to emphasize is that I hope that this takes the idea of human rights out of law enforcement violations, punity, punishment, thinking about human rights as something that requires not only a respect but also protection and fulfillment, and that proactive government policies are needed to fulfill human rights.
All right. Sakiko Fukudapar, Tara Lawson-Reamer, and Susan Randolph, congratulations once again on winning the
Thank you.
2019 Grawemeyer Award in Improving World Order. It's a big deal.